All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Robin Deems, and I am one of the science consultants with the Ohio Department of Education. And this is our December meetup. This month we are partnering with our friends over at Amplify Education, and we're going to be talking a little bit about literacy, science literacy, and literacy in just understanding how to read and how that works. So we have with us a special guest from Amplify, Alestra Menendez. And Alestra was a formal dual immersion teacher and curriculum developer. She brings her expertise in language acquisition and literacy development with three-dimensional teaching and learning. She had served as a literacy specialist and worked with a team of researchers and scientists at the Lawrence Hall of Science to develop the elementary and middle school units that have become what is known as Amplify Science. Alestra managed a team of professional learning specialists to support the implementation of the Amplify Science in urban, suburban, and rural districts across the country. And as an Amplify literacy specialist with a background in science education, she is very uniquely positioned to deliver presentations and workshops that highlight the integration of literacy and science for three-dimensional learning for all teachers, administrators, and science leaders. So welcome, Alestra. We are excited to have you with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I do appreciate the introduction, Robin, and it's so wonderful to be here with everyone talking about what I love most, and that is the integration of literacy and science. So we're going to think today about, how is teaching science really teaching literacy skills? Here are our objectives for today's session. Really, we're thinking about this synergy. How do students develop their literacy background and skills, as well as their knowledge in science? And how can this help us have more time in our classrooms when we can sort of separate, not separate out into silos, but really kind of bring these two practices together. So I do apologize, but I'm going to start with some bad news. And I think this is news we're all very well aware of, but nationally, for the past 20 years, that's what this data is showing us, our students are not proficient in reading. These are NAEP scores for grades 4 as well as for grade 8. This is something that I know all of us are really, thinking about. How can we support learners? And I will say on the science note, one thing to add to this is that because we've been so focused in on like these reading scores and how can we address this issue, a lot of us have put, science on the back burner. We just don't have time to get to it. We maybe do a few minutes a week. And so we're going to think about, well, how can we sort of kind of do two things at once and really build students' literacy as well as their scientific literacy. So I hope folks have heard of The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler, but if not, it's definitely one of the books yay! So I do see that some of you folks are familiar with The Knowledge Gap, so thank you for that. This is a really cool quote that Natalie Wexler brings out, that the important factor, for readers, more so than just the decoding, she talks about we have to have that relevant vocabulary and really building background knowledge. And so hand in hand with her, Jackie Barber, who was the principal investigator at the Lawrence Hall of Science, said, a better way for teaching and learning science and literacy is really to get this placed within a context so that students are figuring out phenomenon. And I'm going to be talking about that today. We can kind of ground this in the simple view of reading if folks are familiar with this. This is the work of Goff and Tumner, who talk about the importance of word recognition as well as language comprehension to build strong readers who can make sense of text. So at Amplify, we build everything on the science of reading. And today we're going to be using Scarborough's rope. This is research from Hollis Scarborough. We're going to be looking at the knowledge strand. She talks about that, building that language comprehension, that really helping our students to build background knowledge, getting that academic vocabulary, and really understanding, verbal reasoning so that they can take up this language and be expressive in it. as well as our approach to science instruction. So what we do is we begin with a phenomenon, and that's anything in our natural world, that we can really engage our students with. And in order to figure out that phenomenon, how something works or the mechanics behind a process, they're going to collect evidence, and then they're going to build increasingly complex explanations using that evidence to support them. And then to transfer their knowledge, they're going to apply what they've been learning to some new context. And that's how we really can gauge the learning. You may have also seen this. This is the work of Tina Chook. I love the work Tina Chook did. She took all of the standards across math, science, and ELA and really tried to find sort of the convergence. And really what Tina had found is that building a strong knowledge basis through context-rich text, grounding in academic discussions, and students writing, around these discussions and these texts really does help to build that knowledge base. And so we can see that there is this beautiful synergy in ELA as well as science. And I would mention also math is there. So let's talk about knowledge building. I'm going to let you watch a video right now where you can sort of see students having some science instruction, but I want you to think about where are the literacy pieces coming out in this, just as you watch these students.
Amplify from K through 8. Students are talking the talk of science. They are thinking like scientists. They are doing like scientists. They're talking like scientists. In preparing for new standards, for shifts in science instruction, for providing our students with opportunities to really dig deeper and to really think at a higher level, we looked for a resource that was different from what we had in the past. We wanted a resource that was phenomenon based, that had strong storylines, that the 3 dimensions of science were interwoven, not treated as separate entities. And it was very obvious to us that Amplify Science was created and developed for NGSS.
So just in that quick little clip there, you saw students engaging in science instruction, but what were some of the literacy things, the practices that you noticed coming out in that video? And we can drop it in the chat. We can come off mute. What sort of stood out to you? I took a few notes myself here. Thinking, doing, talking like scientists. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I wrote down the thinking like scientists, so I appreciate you bringing that out. And then speaking about text, right? So we saw, the students were reading the text, the teachers were reading text to students, and so having these rich, engaging academic discussions within the context of science, but these are literacy skills that students are developing. And so we're going to be thinking about, in their work, how do scientists apply literacy skills, to build their own knowledge? Because this is what we're asking our students to do, as scientists, as engineers. We're going to be using these literacy practices as well. So we have a Jamboard. And if folks are not familiar with Jamboard, I'll go ahead and walk you through how we actually use this. So let me do a quick test. I'm going to drop this link in the chat so we can all access the Jamboard. And if I'm successful, I am going to see anonymous animals populating my Jamboard here. So let me take a look and see. Oh, it looks okay. So we've got a blobfish and a hamster and a dolphin. Okay, it's successful. Let me share with you how we're going to engage in this Jamboard. We're going to be looking at some science lessons, and we're going to determine if students are developing their literacy skills, or do we think students are developing their background science knowledge with this particular lesson? I would go ahead and I would click on one of these sticky notes and I would write my name so that we have 2 to 3 people in a group. And then after I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to determine if I think this lesson is literacy development, science development, maybe I'm kind of on the fence about it. Maybe I kind of see aspects of both. And if somebody comes on my Jamboard and they don't agree with me, all they have to do is duplicate this and they can move it to another area. So if we do have some disagreement, that's okay. I think it's great for us to have kind of this discussion around what do we think students are developing in these particular lessons. I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions before we take 6 minutes. Okay, and I'm going to start a timer and I'll just kind of be perusing and going through. If you need a new frame, you can click this arrow and get a new group. So we've got about 4 groups here. Okay, I see folks have started. Go ahead and give you a moment. Check and see how folks are doing. Oh, wow. You're quick sorters. Okay, we've got a few here. It looks like folks were able to really do a quick sort. So I'm going to go ahead and just add another minute. Will that give you folks enough time? Okay, I'm seeing heads nod. Okay, and if you're just sorting one last one, we've got about 30 seconds. Maybe look and see what your companions have sort of sorted. If there's any sort of agreement, or maybe you want to sort of challenge someone's ideas in a respectful way, we can do that as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up now. And that's time. Okay, so what did we see? I'm going to go ahead and before we share, I'll just go do a quick kind of run through as I'm projecting my screen so we can see that here we see some discrete literacy skills and discrete science knowledge. Here it looks like things are kind of a little more in the middle. And then we've got some agreement. Love that. Wow, we've got kind of some ideas here. It almost looks like a continuum across in this group. And then I see that we've got maybe 2 different ideas about where this analyzing antibiotic experiment data. So very, very interesting. Okay, I am just going to go ahead and call on folks to share a little bit of their thinking, and I hope that is okay. Tracy, I hope it's all right to start with you because you gave me the best segue today talking about disciplinary literacy, which is exactly what we're engaging in right here. Tracy, do you want to share a little bit about your ideas and what frame I can go to?
What frame, were we supposed to do this by ourselves?
Oh, you could do it by yourself or with a partner.
Okay. So what I was thinking is like, the partners reading and discussing a book. They're not really, they're reading about science. So I thought that was more literacy than if they were doing something hands-on and then they read the book. So I felt like that was really working on literacy because they're looking for key ideas about magnets.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anyone want to share sort of their ideas of what they were kind of noticing, what the biggest takeaways were as they were looking at sort of, is this literacy, is this science? Appreciate you, Tracy. Thanks for letting me call on you.
Okay.
We'll take a volunteer now.
Alustra, I would love for you to look at slide 2.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone see that I'm here on the second slide? Okay, so this is really interesting. I think they're developing both literacy and science and knowledge in all examples. And then we have a really big agree totally. So it's really fascinating that there could be an argument made for each of these activities, even when students, I noticed a little tension with the antibiotics. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit larger. Students are analyzing data from antibiotic experiments with mice to determine the relevance of different pieces of evidence. So they may have some numerical data, but even in engaging in that conversation about what the data means, we're using those speaking and listening skills. So I do appreciate that, you know, this green sticky here, that thank you, Lydia and Kathy, for, you know, for your thoughtfulness in doing this sort. So kind of taking this idea, and this is a Jamboard that you have access to. So if you want to go through and kind of look at other people's ideas, you're welcome to do that. But I'm going to take us into, let's think about this with respect to reading in science. So reading in science, we know that scientists read texts in a particular way. They are going to be doing an investigation, so they want to know what are the investigations that took place prior. They're going to be looking for additional evidence, and so they're looking for that in text. And so we want to apprentice students to do this as well. And so one of the things that we look at in science texts and making this accessible to students is the qualitative measures. So what does a student need to understand to really understand this text? And we have a lot of things that students need to grapple with. They need to understand text features. They need to understand when information is presented in paragraphs, or is it going to be labeled illustrations or diagrams or processes? So these are sort of some of the qualitative measures. And what you see here is a K2 text. As we move students using these texts, they also need to understand you don't always read, for example, a reference book start to finish. You may just have to go to the particular information that you need at that time. It gets more complex when we move to grades 3, 4, 5, where students have more sophisticated visuals that they need to interpret, or maybe there's a lot of information in the caption that now they need to make sure that they're kind of taking in the information from all different aspects of these texts. When we think about quantitative measures, such as, you know, what is the length of the sentence? What is the vocabulary load? What a lot of folks have done in the past, and I understand why, is we've simplified the text for students. Well, not all students are reading at grade level, or not all students can comprehend this text, so we're going to simplify it. And I'm going to share with you why that's not always the best approach. So if we look at two texts, this particular text has been simplified for students. Very simple sentence structure, you know, subject, verb. There's only one vocabulary word being introduced to students in this particular text. So we see the word fossil or fossils is another example of that. But when we give students complex text to read, they're going to be engaging with academic vocabulary more so. So here we see that there are more academic vocabulary words, and also science. If you've ever read, you know, popular science or science research, the language is very complex. So to be able to give students an opportunity to read complex language, to be able to take that up and to move forward, for students to be able to speak and read in the language of science, we want to give them that exposure. So you see here that by simplifying the text, we're really removing a lot of this wonderful learning that can be happening. We also know that another measure of text complexity is sort of the task. What are we asking our students to do? And this is really where, they need to kind of leverage their background knowledge. They need to feel that there's a purpose and some motivation. So what we do is in every unit, in Amplify Science, we actually give students a role. They're going to either be a scientist or an engineer, kindergarten through 8th grade. So what you see here in our flask is that students have had multiple opportunities to sort of embody that role and engage as this scientist would. Maybe they're a marine scientist in 1st grade, and then they were a pinball engineer in kindergarten. They're going to be a sky scientist in 5th grade. So all of these different roles, they get a chance to practice and sort of visualize themselves in. I'm going to share with you this young man, and I'll be very quiet because I don't think he's very loudly spoken. So let's see if you can hear.
When I grow up, I want to be an astronomer because ever since we started to Amplify Science and learned about space, it made me want to learn more about the universe and stars and other planets like exoplanets.
So if you couldn't hear him, because he was able to be an astronomer in his unit, now he wants to study exoplanets. And at his age, I didn't even know there was a thing such as exoplanets, actually, even in my adult life. So it's just really amazing that by giving them sort of this purpose, why are we reading? We're reading to learn more about these, your role as an astronomer. So when we are thinking about, what we used to think about literacy stages and the way students take up reading and writing and language, we used to think that we had to start with basic literacy. We could only start here, not until they learn to read, can we get them reading to learn. And then later we could build upon that with fluency and comprehension. And then finally, as Tracy mentioned, we could get to the disciplinary literacy. But fortunately, we have Shanahan and Shanahan who, through their work have really reconceptualized this. And students can be working on their basic literacy while they're also, working in disciplinary literacy and understanding the ways in which scientists, historians, how do they engage with text and in conversations. So disciplinary literacy practices and science instruction can beautifully converge. So when we give students activities that are authentic to the practices of science, we're looking at this text because we want to find more evidence, or I just kind of want to, surface some questions I have. We're going to be building our knowledge. We're going to also give them some explicit instruction around the vocabulary that they're going to be needing to use to understand and conceptualize these ideas. So the way that we engage students in these disciplinary literacy practices is, we give them entry points. So students might conduct a firsthand investigation before they go to a text, so they have a little bit of background knowledge. They're going to participate in academic discourse so that they can grapple with the ideas and that they can share and learn from their peers. My partner might have made an observation that I didn't, it didn't even occur to me. And now both of us can move forward with that knowledge. They're also going to be reading complex text. And what you see here is students are reading these texts in partnerships because we want them not only to support each other with the reading, but also with the comprehension and with the ideas that are surfacing. And if they're going in for the same purpose, they can help each other as they progress through that text. We also ask students to write authentically as scientists do. And scientists generally will write, in 2 genres. They're writing scientific explanations to explain phenomenon, or they're formulating an argument and supporting a claim. And so we want to have students also writing. So you'll see this is, an example of elementary and middle school students are also learning about what is a scientific argument. We want students also to be making mental models and visualizing. So here what you'll see is we've got some diagrams, but we also have some simulations. And this can also be that entry point into the ideas. Oh, they can sort of see the way our natural world works and functions through a simulation. So here is our model that we use, and kind of you're going to see sort of a lot of this you've sort of seen in visuals, but we really start by pairing that. What are students doing? Are they doing a hands-on investigation and then reading to really conceptualize and understand what it is that they saw? Are they going to start with a reading to give them a little bit of background knowledge, and then we're going to take them to a hands-on investigation? But these are tightly paired activities. And then we ask them to talk about what they read, or talk about what they observed, or look at their data table. And so what kind of patterns are you seeing? And then we use that as rehearsal. So now that we've had a conversation about this, let's go write about it. Maybe it's a quick write. Maybe it's going to be something that they're going to formulate into an explanation or an argument, but it provides that oral discourse as a lovely rehearsal to the written explanation or arguments they're going to construct. And again, we always want students to be making these mental models, adjusting their schema. So we support them by visualizing a lot of what they're seeing and thinking about. So this really helps us in this multimodal do, talk, read, write, visualize, we call the model. It really helps students through a different, system of modalities come and arrive at these science concepts. So I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions on that. I know that I'm.
Alestra, we do have a question from Tim. How would you apply this to the K-2 classroom?
Yes, so I can share a little bit with you. So for example, with our K2, and you probably can't see this, but you'll see the size of it. This is a big book. And so for K2, I might start off by reading a big book to give my students some context about, for example, what are forces? Forces can be a push or a pull. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to read about forces. We're going to practice saying those words. I'm going to post those words up on my vocabulary word wall. And then we're going to engage in a hands-on activity. We're going to play rug ball, and I'm going to push the ball to my students, and my students are going to push the ball to their peers. And notice that this is one kind of force. And then we're going to talk about pulling forces. So really the teacher is situating it by, providing some context to students, giving them some grade level appropriate investigations. And then at the end of that unit, students actually, because they are pinball engineers, they learn about pinball machines, and then they construct a pinball machine. So using rubber bands, popsicle sticks, they notice that when you exert a strong force, the pinball will move farther. When you exert a soft force, it won't travel as far. So they're really making those connections, but at a kindergarten level. I hope that was helpful, Tim.
And then Alestra, another question is, you were talking about the books. Why are there no leveled readers for introducing concepts to students? Especially after COVID, there's a lot of concern about that.
Right. And, I think that, and I understand, because we do have our students in all, different places in their reading proficiency. When we provide students with one text, and we, instead of leveling that text, but provide scaffolds of that one text, students are all exposed to the same key vocabulary, complex language, and ideas, and they can all engage in the same conversations. They can all write to the same prompts. And so one of the scaffolds might be, my student is going to listen to this text. So we do have audio versions of all of our texts read by, voice actors. And so a student might need to read the text first and follow along, whereas another student might be able to independently read that text. If I had my student in one of those simplified texts, they wouldn't have the same vocabulary. They wouldn't have that same complex language. And so this really is, providing equitable instruction for all of your students. Okay, thank you, Katie, for your question. And any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or pause me, because I'm happy to. But we're going to look at, we look sort of at literacy and how we develop the literacy, but let's look at those science and engineering practices. So when we think of the science and engineering practices that are authentic to the work of professional scientists and engineers, these are the practices that research has found that they use in their work. And when we look at these through the lens of literacy, what we notice is that a lot of these are language-based practices. So when we ask questions or we define a problem, when we have to analyze and interpret data and have, communicate about that in a scientific paper, we have to use language for constructing explanations, of course, and arguments. But also, it's hard to find any lesson in science where you're not obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And we do this through language. So it's just such a beautiful coherence, I think, between, the way we develop literacy and the way that we engage in science practices. I'm pausing to see if there are any questions on the practices. Okay, I really appreciate your question, Tim. So I'm going to share with you some research that really blew me away. Before I started at the Lawrence Hall of Science, of course, I was a classroom teacher, and I always thought that by the time students reached third grade, their listening comprehension and their reading comprehension were on par. And I found out that I was incorrect. What you see here from this research is it actually isn't until middle school, where with the same text, students would be able to comprehend that text, whether they read it or someone reads it to them. And so in K1, we do leverage that. So as I shared, the teacher would engage in that read aloud, building the students' background knowledge, but students will also create their own mini books. And because they've been exposed to the language repeatedly, they'll be able to read their own, written mini books as well. In K5, we move to partner reading. And so here the students are supporting one another as they read. And as we move into middle school, we ask students to engage in what's called active reading. And here they're annotating questions they may have, highlighting any evidence, looking for connecting ideas. Here in this sample annotation, what you see is this young man has asked a question here in the margin, and then later answered his own question. So this is really nice when we get students engaging in close reading of text. And this is explicitly taught in the first unit. So teachers have an explicit way of, instructing students, how do we read science text, when we're looking for evidence or asking questions. Moving to writing as scientists, I had mentioned, those explanations as well as those arguments. So why do we have students write in science? Well, we want to activate their background knowledge. So sometimes that's a small write. What do you know about X? Before we start, a new unit in geology. We might ask students to reflect on their understanding after they've done either, a hands-on investigation, looked at a simulation, maybe just read an article with a partner. We might ask them to engage in some sense making. Okay, well, kind of like, let's take stock now. What are you understanding now? We might ask them to write because they need to record their observations, or they need to draw a diagram or record some data. Sometimes we need to write to organize our ideas in a graphic organizer, or we need to write because I'm about to share with my whole class, and let me rehearse this first, or I'm going to share with a partner and we're both going to share ideas. So let's write it down before we, so we can have that really focused discussion. And then of course, to explain and to argue. So we do teach students explicitly what is the difference between an explanation and an argument. We provide them with some guidelines, and like this is sort of here for us to sort of see, compare and contrast. But with the younger students, we ask kindergarten, first and second graders to write scientific explanations, and here's sort of their task list, and we give them sort of mentor text to see what an explanation looks like, and then engage in some shared writing. To write an explanation, they need to use the language of science. So we provide these frames. For example, a frog can survive because it uses camouflage to not be caught. And so the teacher might walk through a few of these using pictures and word cards to really support using that language of science. And then of course, writing planners for the younger students. Students will also be making co-constructed charts with their teacher, as well as, engaging in shared writing. So the teacher is going to model how to write that explanation. And then students have ways to sort of record their data or, respond to prompts in their investigation notebooks, as well as writing their own mini books in K1. When we move into second through third grade, then we pose questions to students and they're constructing their own explanations. But again, we give them that support. So here we're asking students to, record your data and your observations. So, they may be looking at some cards of evidence and looking at some trait variation. Then we say, okay, now reflect on your understanding. Let's go ahead and talk about how are these wolves different? Let's look at all of the words we're using: trait, variation. How do these words relate to one another? Let's do a written reflection. And then we ask them, okay, let's keep track of this. What is the information that's going to be useful to you? Really to answer this question about why this wolf looks different from its pack. And then finally, let's write an explanation. So it's very explicit and really provide students that gradual release of responsibility. So we give them the guidelines, and then we share, here's an example of what an explanation looks like. Then we say, let's look over these guidelines. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write the topic sentence with you as a class, but you're going to go write your explanation. Now we're going to review the guidelines in the next chapter, and this time it's a fully independent writing. So we want to gradually release them before we ask them to write sophisticated things like scientific explanations. Also, when we ask students to write scientific arguments, we want to do the same thing, provide that gradual release. And the way we do that is we have a science seminar, which is a sequence. So if you've ever done Socratic seminars with students in science, the first thing we do is we evaluate evidence. What evidence supports the claim that I'm going to be arguing for? And so students do that in groups, with cards of evidence. And then let's come together and let's talk about this in a Socratic seminar. Let's talk about, how this evidence supports a claim. And maybe someone pushes back on my idea and I have to change my ideas. I get to do all of that cognitive work before I'm asked to write an actual formal scientific argument. And so we ask students, from the first unit to really consider all of the parts of a scientific argument. We give them very explicit instruction on what does it mean, to have a claim that is supported by evidence. What does it mean to have stronger or weaker evidence? And what about the source of the evidence? How is that important? So after students have had this explicit instruction and practice across the course of a unit, for example, then they're able to sort of take on ownership of the seminar. And this is student-led. The teacher takes a step back. The students are running the conversation. They know that they need to support their ideas with evidence. They need to be open to changing their minds. So for example, they may have 3 claims that they're considering, and they've selected evidence that they feel supports one of these claims, and one of these claims is the strongest. So then we give them a reasoning tool and we say, and you may be familiar with claim evidence reasoning as a model. Okay, so what is your claim? And so students will, identify, well, the claim that I'm supporting is this one: South China was cooler then than it is today. And I'm going to use this evidence card. Here's a map, and here's, the map of, what the temperature was like at that particular time. And here is how my evidence connects to my claim. I'm using my reasoning. So students have this way to sort of plan that, sophisticated skill of formulating a scientific argument. And then we give them sort of also additional scaffolds. We're going to state our claim. Let's describe our evidence. And now let's explain, how does this evidence support your claim? So that students are gradually released. We don't expect them to do this right away. We walk them through and provide scaffolds for them. So I'm going to pause there after I've shared if there are any questions on sort of our writing and how we help students in, to develop those literacy skills in writing through science.
Alestra, I have a question I would love for you to answer for everyone.
For sure.
If I were to go to my classroom tomorrow, what is something I could do right now to start merging that literacy and science?
You just gave me a great segue.
Okay.
Thank
We're
you
a good team there.
Team. You know, one of the things that we had talked about is sort of, you know, we're looking at sort of this merging of here is a model for, you know, phenomenon-based science instruction. And here is a model of really sound knowledge building with respect to literacy and the way that they converge. Some of the things that you've seen visually and you've heard me talk about are these really authentic conversations around content. So whatever science you're using, you know, having students talk with each other about the ideas, but also to be using and taking up that vocabulary, you know, using the vocabulary. One thing that we do is we provide students with cards, and each card has a vocabulary word on it. And they have to map the connections to it. Sometimes we say, use 2 of the cards in your stack. And they have to say, well, you know, we can see that the features that this wolf has is, you know, related to its parents. So, you know, we're getting students to kind of practice using that vocabulary. Another thing that I think is really supportive is if you're having, for example, you do hands-on investigations, whether you're growing plants, you're observing terrariums, you're having your students, you know, kind of think about, you know, the movement of the earth about the sun. You know, you can be recording about that and writing, you know, mini books about that with your younger students and with older students, you know, providing them opportunities to write that as an explanation. Well, you know, why is it, you know, cooler in the fall and warmer in the summer? You know, that phenomenon-based writing instruction. Oh, Tracy, we lost Tracy, but that was great having you, and she can watch the rest of the video for any other questions. And are there any other questions pertaining to this idea? Because I'm happy to get a little more nuanced or granular as we think about, you know, how can we do this in our classrooms tomorrow?
Alestra, what about, especially in elementary, just the struggle to find time for science teaching?
Right.
And, you know, we hear it's so much prep, it's so much work. I really don't know. I don't have a science background. I mean, I look at this, and you're the best person to kind of answer this. How do we show elementary teachers that you have everything you need to be a science teacher in your classroom and you're not taking away from literacy?
So I have a wonderful quote that just is near and dear to my heart. So we had 2 principal investigators. P. David Pearson is from University of Berkeley. He was the dean of the Graduate School of Education, and Jackie Barber actually ran the Lawrence Hall of Science Learning Design Group that developed this curriculum. And what they sort of, it's a mutual quote that literacy is a discipline in search of content, and science is a discipline in search of communication. So it's really beautiful, because when we think about, I want to build my students' literacy skills around what content, what is giving them the motivation to read, what is giving them the motivation to write or to have a conversation with a peer or in a class discussion, you know, what are they listening for? It really provides that purpose, science as a context to develop literacy. And it can be any science, not necessarily amplify science, you know, any science curriculum. You're going to have content that is, you know, going to be striking up the curiosity of your students and giving them that motivation to want to read text, to want to look closely at the language and the vocabulary. I hope that's helpful, because I do think that one thing I heard when I worked in PD for a long time, and I would go and I would visit classrooms, and teachers oftentimes would say, you know what we did? We moved the science lesson into our literacy block because we're working on informational text. And so I would just take that informational text from, this science unit and bring it into my literacy block. And now we're having, literacy conversations around animal defenses.
Thank you. I just love hearing that, because at elementary especially, that's when they're the most curious, and we can just do so much with them at that point.
Right. Yeah. And yes, definitely. For elementary teachers, what they're going to find is a lot of the things that they're doing in their literacy, they're doing in science. So for example, teachers will say, well, because we're making predictions before we go into the text, they do that in science as well. What do we predict might happen? Or what do we predict might be the explanation for this? Making inferences. These are things that we do as readers. Well, let's make some inferences. Why do we think, it was so chilly in the morning on the playground? What inferences can we make about that? So these are mutually, beneficial to both disciplines, using these sort of skills and strategies. Any other questions? I'm seeing that we're getting close to the 50-minute mark, and I wanted to make sure that I'm going to go ahead and share a few things as additional resources before we close today. But if you look at, if anybody here listens to the Science of Reading podcast, I did want to highlight that there is actually season 1. There's actually an episode there with Jackie Barber, and that's where you'll hear the quote that I just quoted, where her and P. David Pearson are talking about, the importance of having rich content to build literacy skills around. So that's our podcast. In addition, we also have a Facebook group. So if you wanted to, kind of see how folks are using science and literacy, you can also join there. But I'm going to go ahead and pause. I know we do have a few more minutes for questions, and I can go back into any of the previous areas. So if we want to talk about the reading or the writing or even the text complexity, happy to do that.
I am adding in the chat the link to Jackie's podcast on the science of reading. And if you're not familiar with this podcast, it's probably some of the best professional development I personally have ever had. Every week it's a different presenter. The one this week is all about building kind of resilience in students who are suffering because of COVID. Wonderful podcast, but let me add the Jackie Barber one.
Thank you for that.
You are so welcome. It's season 1, episode 21, and I'll write that in here just in case that link is only to the actual podcast site. Season 1, episode 21. There you go.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, now I just came back in here. I think Tim had to go, but I'm looking to see if there are any other questions coming in the chat. Oh, you're welcome. Elizabeth writes, the opportunity to think deeply about the difference between explanations and arguments. Oh, I'm so happy that was helpful for you. So thank you for that comment. One of the things that we do in K through 2 is really engage students in formulating explanations. They get to build on that in 3 through 5. And then in grade 3, actually, that's when we introduce students to claim evidence and reasoning. And we do it very explicitly towards the end of the year, but students actually are able to, use evidence and support a claim and provide some reasoning around that with, of course, scaffolding and support. So it's neat to see that progression from third
I
grade.
personally was just in a classroom and they were in our second grade unit where the principal sends a letter and you can edit it so it's your principal, but there's a glue shortage, we need your help. And so the students actually create glue. And what was neat in this classroom is they used their glue to make their Thanksgiving crafts that were going home to be on the Thanksgiving table. So it was just neat to see this kind of science in a second grade classroom. I would love to know from those on the call or on the webinar now, what are some ways you've helped bring science back into the classroom? Because a lot of it went away during COVID. It was the least taught subject. I would love to know if you have some great shares outs about that. Well, I sure hope it's being taught. It's definitely kind of a national crisis right now. I mean, that's the research is showing. Before COVID, science was being taught an average of 16 minutes a week in a typical elementary classroom, and now it's down to about 8, if at all.
I will, and I do want to say that one of the things, and I think this is like, for science researchers and curriculum developers, as well as, educators, it's so disheartening because, I mean, it's almost like a paradoxical, because here we are coming from, a global pandemic. And what we need more than ever are science-informed citizens and the next stage of scientists. So it's almost even more important now than ever to really get our students to be scientifically literate and to nurture those next students. I showed sort of that, that flask model of all the different kinds of scientists, and it does take all of the different kinds of scientists really to support our human endeavor, to keep us healthy and safe and exploring, space and just so many different things. So it just, whenever I hear that 16 minutes a week and now 8, it is heartbreaking. Yeah. So anyway, I just had to mention that. I find it very paradoxical.
I was just curious, Alestra, what grade level was that at that you quoted those numbers, the 16 and the 8?
I'll actually have the article, so I will send it to you. This was a pre-COVID. It was about 16 to 18 minutes a day was the average. So I'll get that article. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie.
Okay. So, Katie, I guess, are you going to drop that article in the chat?
I'm grabbing it. I should have it saved because it made me sad when I saw it. So let's see. Okay. It's from January 5th of last year, or sorry, of this year. So it is not that old of an article. Okay, it's from the 74th. Let's see. I'm going to paste it in the chat. And there you go.
I don't know if she's still on the call, but if you wanted to take a photograph of this explanations and arguments, I just put it back up on the screen again. Sometimes people like to kind of snap a photo. I know you are going to get this as a recording, but if you wanted to grab the science and explanation sort of guidelines, I'm just putting those back up as well.
And in the article I just pasted, it was a 2018 survey showed that K3 was spending an average of 18 minutes per week on science, a 22% decrease since 2000. And in 4-6, it's 27 minutes a week and a 13% decrease. And this was pre-pandemic. So that's why it's kind of my mantra. I just want to see science taught in the elementary schools again. And I think teachers it would just be what they need right now. Kids, of course, when they're engaged, you have less discipline problems, which that alone right now would be a godsend to a lot of classrooms. And teachers just get so excited to see how engaged the students are. And I think teachers right now need that kind of motivation. I see such a loss of, I don't know how to explain it, but I can tell teachers are just suffering right now.
And definitely, like, look at this little gentleman here. Looks so excited to learn. And I know that just gonna, really give that teacher also that, just that sense of, gratification, when our students are motivated and they are learning. And he's got his little pen and paper there as well. So that's a beautiful image.
I know. I just thought this article was fantastic and very eye-opening to me.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we are just about at the time. So Alestra and I are definitely available if you want to email us. And Alestra, if you throw your email in the chat and I'll throw mine. We have lots of resources to share, and they're not just related to Amplify, just in science in general, to help you kind of get this conversation started in your own district. I have copies of Jackie Barber's book. I'd be more than happy to send anyone interested. It's basically no more text and science in isolation. Let's bring literacy and science together. And I have a feeling her quote is probably in that book. I thought I saw it in there, but I can't remember. I read it so long ago. So just email me if you would like a copy of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie and Alestra, for joining us today and giving us hope for getting science back in, even if it is, looking at tackling it through the lens of literacy. And thank you so much for your words and your uplifting thoughts and some great data that may be a little sad, but you need to know what the battle is before you can forge through it. So that's good to know as well. Thanks everybody for joining us. We will be back on January the 11th when we'll be talking about probing for understanding and high quality student data and what that looks like in science. And you can find the connection information for all of our sessions, including the recording of today's session, will be posted on there in about a week or so that you can share with any of your colleagues that weren't able to join us today. Those are all on our resource page. And again, thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful winter break. We're almost to the end of first semester. Yay. I know it has been a crazy one again. And so everyone is definitely much deserved of a nice, restful holiday time. So enjoy time with your family and friends, and we'll see you all back in January. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.